Hello, everyone, and welcome today to our webinar entitled Portrait of English-Speaking Mature Workers. So this is a research done by the Provincial Employment Roundtable, which I will let our presenter, Sta, their Director of Policy Research, introduce when she begins. I just want to take this moment to first thank our funders, the Department of Canadian Heritage, for the opportunity today. And without further ado, I think I will pass it over to Sta to dive into this wonderful topic. Sta, over to you.
Great, thanks, Andrew. So I'll just give Brendan a moment to get our slides set up. And while he does that, I'll introduce myself. So my name is Kuzviwanza. I'm the Director of Policy and Research at the Provincial Employment Roundtable. It's such a pleasure to be here this morning. Thank you very much, Katya, Andrew, Brendan, for welcoming me. And I'm hoping that this presentation will be interesting to you and you'll have some questions for me at the end. And I'll be sure to leave some time at the end to give you a chance to ask those, and I will do my best to answer them. Okay, so next slide. About PERT. So the Provincial Employment Roundtable is actually a relatively new organization. We were founded in 2020. We're based in Montreal, but we cover the entire province. And we are a nonprofit multi-stakeholder initiative focused on addressing the employment and employability challenges that are facing Quebec's English-speaking communities. Through our research and stakeholder work, we engage all levels of policymakers to develop solutions and ensure adequate resources to improve the labor market outcomes of all English-speaking Quebecers. So that's our mission. And we have two main pillars. So we do research and policy, which is what I lead on our team. So generally, we're working to develop a deeper understanding of the challenges and problems in the employability and employment landscape in Quebec. We are identifying gaps in the data, and we're trying to improve the availability of information because, as you may know, there's actually not a lot of information, specifically labor market information about English speakers in Quebec. And then we're also looking to develop solutions and policy recommendations, which we're often targeting towards the provincial government, but also sometimes the federal government and municipal government. We also do engagement, which kind of feeds into the policy and research as well. And that's about fostering an environment of engagement and collaboration between different stakeholder groups, mobilizing resources and other solutions, and working with governments for the benefits of our stakeholders. So that's what we do. Next slide, please. So in terms of the data I'm going to be presenting you today, this data comes from two main sources. So the first one is the Census of Canada. So this is from the 2021 census, which is our most recent census. We use this data from the Census of Canada to present economic and employment data for our community, as this is one of the only data sources that enables us to look at linguistic identity. So the census is important in the sense that when you're looking for employment-related linguistic data, the census is actually the only source. The provincial government does collect labor force data, but they don't collect or aggregate it down to language. So you wouldn't be able to see how English speakers are faring in Quebec's labor market if you look on the provincial government sources. But if you look at the Census of Canada, you are able to see that. Unfortunately, one of the limitations there is that the census is only collected every 5 years. So we're only able to actually have this data every 5 years. And in between, we're having to rely on other methods of data collection to understand what's going on in the English-speaking community. Those other data methods include qualitative research, which is the other data source that we have here. So we have focus groups from a project that we did earlier last year in the fall of 2023, but also going into earlier this year. We conducted focus groups with 22 mature workers to understand the barriers, issues, and opportunities that they faced in Quebec's labor market. So I'll be sharing some of the results of that research with you as well. Okay, next slide. So just a few definitions just to help you situate yourself as you look at the data that I'm going to be sharing. So English speakers and French speakers in this profile are classified according to Statistics Canada's definition of first official language spoken. Individuals who speak both English and French as their first official language are evenly divided among English and French speakers, and this is done to provide a more accurate portrait of the Anglophone and Francophone population in Quebec. So just like a brief definition of first official language spoken, which is the third bullet here. The full designation is a derived concept. It takes into account a person's knowledge of Canada's two official languages, their mother tongue, and their home language. So in the census, if you get a longer form census, which is about 25% of the population, they might ask you, what is your mother tongue? What is your home language? Which of Canada's official languages do you feel more comfortable speaking? And depending on your answers, Statistics Canada is going to sort you into English speaker, French speaker, or both English and French. And we take those designations and we divvy them up, and we're able to pull data for English speakers and French speakers. I hope that's somewhat clear. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them near the end. Okay, so let's jump into our data. So let's start with population, just to get just a basic picture of who we're talking about here. So just to remind you, there are roughly 1.24 million English speakers that live in Quebec. This is out of a total population of 8.3 million people. So when we do a breakdown of the population, you'll see in this graph here that we have age groups from age 45 and over, broken down and aggregated into groups of about 11-year age brackets. So this is how StatCan actually presents and breaks down this data. So we used the same format. And these percentages represent their respective share of the population. So for example, individuals who are 65 to 74 years old, the English speakers represent about 8.9% of the total English speaking population. English speakers who are 75 years and over represent about 6% of the total English speaking population. So a bit unsurprisingly here, population declines according to age, but when we break it down according to linguistic identity, we actually see that older English speakers tend to make up a smaller proportion of the English speaking community than French speakers do in the French speaking community. So I'll just give you a second to look at that. And while you look at that, you might be asking why we include the 45 to 54 years age group for mature workers. I mean, depending on who you are, you might think like 45, is maybe not considered a mature worker. But according to the provincial government, it is. So they have defined individuals in the workforce who are 45 years and older as individuals who are underrepresented in the labor market. So when they talk about mature workers, according to provincial policymakers, they're talking about people who are 45 and older. So we chose to include them there. Alrighty, next slide. Labor force participation. So in terms of age, labor force participation goes down as workers get older. But when we break it down according to linguistic identity, we see that English-speaking mature workers have higher labor force participation than their age peers. So you'll see in the graph here, just to remind you, labor force participation, these are individuals who are in the labor market. So they are either already working or they are looking for work. So when StatCan asks them, are you working or are you actively looking for work in the past 2 weeks? And they say, yes, I am. They will be counted as someone who is participating in the labor market. So if you look at this age breakdown, perhaps unsurprisingly, right, as we get older, as we age and we go down to 75 and over, we see that the labor force participation does go down, right? And workers become less active in the labor market. However, interestingly, is that we saw that there is a linguistic difference here, right? So we see it most here at the 55 to 64 years of age bracket, but also the 65 to 74 years of age. Interestingly, for 65 to 74 years, which is typically the age of retirement, we are seeing that English-speaking workers who are 65 to 74 are actually remaining active in the labor market. So that's the 25.9% that you're seeing there. And that's compared to French speakers of the same age group, who are 18.9% of them are in the labor market. So when we saw that, we thought that was interesting, right? That there is that linguistic difference, perhaps, and just a different experience of people who are choosing to remain in the labor market longer. Okay, next slide. So this one is top regions for senior workers. So what we did is we pulled a distribution of employed English speakers who are age 65 and over by administrative region. And we just wanted to see where are they working in terms of the regions that they live in. So according to the census, the top 5 regions where English speakers age 65 and over work are Montreal, so 59.8% of English speakers age 65 and over are working in Montreal. This is followed by Montérégie at 13.4%, Laval at 6%, Outaouais at 5.5%, and Estrie at 4.6%. So I mean, when we saw this, Montreal is perhaps unsurprising, right? It's the largest population of English speakers in Quebec. So it would make sense perhaps that there's more English speakers age 65 and over working there. But for the other regions, these are also the more urban regions, right? Montérégie, Laval, Outaouais, Estrie. So maybe it's more so in urban regions, English speakers working who are age 65 and over tend to be working in those regions, right? And what those reasons for them remaining longer in the labor market are, we're not sure. So if anyone has any theories or ideas to kind of explain why urban seniors tend to remain in the labor market longer, that would be interesting to know. Okay, next slide. Top industries among mature English-speaking workers. So what we did is we actually looked at the industry breakdown just to understand for mature workers, what industries are they working in according to age bracket. And what we found was pretty interesting. So in the age 45 to 54 range, right? So this is the younger end of the mature worker spectrum. We see that manufacturing is actually the leading industry. So that's 11.3%. This is relatively unsurprising. So when you look at broader data for English speakers across the province, and this is regardless of age, manufacturing tends to be one of the leading industries for English speakers. So that kind of made sense when we saw that. And then the second one is healthcare and social assistance, which is at 11%, and then professional, scientific, and technical services, which is 10.3%. So professional, scientific, and technical services is a pretty broad category, but it's pretty much anyone that's working like a desk job that's not specifically in healthcare and social science, social assistance might be categorized under this industry. And when we go up an age bracket to workers who are 55 to 65, manufacturing remains the top industry at a larger rate, actually, so 12.9%, followed by healthcare and then professional, scientific, and technical services. Things start to switch up when you go into the senior range. So now when you look at 65 to 74 years old for mature English-speaking workers, we see that the top industry is healthcare and social assistance. So manufacturing has fallen off the top 3 there in terms of industry. And then we have professional, scientific, and technical services. And then we also have educational services as the third most common industry for workers in this age bracket. And then lastly, for workers age 75, healthcare is leading, professional, scientific, and technical, and then also educational services. So it seems like 65 and older, generally workers tend to work more in healthcare, social assistance, education, professional roles as well. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, unemployment rate. So just a reminder, unemployment rate, these are individuals who report looking for work, but being unable to find work. So they are participating in the labor market, they just haven't found a job yet. So in terms of age, unemployment rate increases as workers get older. But when we break it down according to linguistic identity, we see that English-speaking mature workers age 65 and older have a lower unemployment rate than their Francophone age peers. So if you look at the graph here, you'll see the total unemployment rate. This is total age. The first stack of bar graphs here is the unemployment rate for the total English-speaking population across the province is 10.9%. Compared to Francophones, it's 6.9%. So we know that English speakers tend to have higher unemployment rates than French speakers in Quebec as a whole. However, when we look at the age breakdowns here from 45 and older, we see that that unemployment rate difference kind of holds for age 45 to 54. So in that age bracket, English speakers are still, let's say, struggling more in the labor market. They have higher unemployment rates than French speakers. We still see a 4% difference here of 8.6% compared to 4.6% for French speakers. When we move up to the 55 to 64 age bracket, we still see that English speakers tend to have higher unemployment rates, right? They're at 10.8% unemployment compared to 7.3% amongst French-speaking 55 to 64 years old. However, this is where it got interesting for us because that trend does not hold when you look at seniors who are 65 and older. So what you see is actually for seniors 65 to 74 years old, we see that English speakers have a 12.5% unemployment rate. However, Francophone workers have a 16.4% unemployment rate. So their unemployment rate is actually higher than English speakers who are 65 to 74. And then lastly, for individuals who are 75 and over, we see that the Francophone unemployment rate shoots up to 33.1%, which is extremely high, right? That's about a third of the Francophone labor force who are 75 and older are looking for work but unable to find it. And this is compared to an unemployment rate of 13.8% amongst English speakers who are 75 and over. So we thought this was pretty interesting, right? Just seeing that there is that kind of break in the trend between mature workers who are 45 to 64 and those who are 65 and older. I'd be curious if anyone, again, has any theories about why we see that difference and that shift. One theory that we heard when we interviewed participants about why we might see this changing trend is that they said that particularly for English speakers, as they get older, particularly let's say the older generation who are like 65 and older, they might have stronger community ties, right? So when they are looking for work, let's say they are looking for work in their community, they're looking for like a small healthcare job or like a job in education or in social assistance, they might already know, who to ask, right? Because the English speaking community tends to be more tight knit and it's a smaller community, particularly in the regions. So perhaps finding work might be slightly easier as you get older, which might maybe explain some of the lower unemployment rates that we're seeing for 65 plus. But that's just one theory. So if you, again, have any ideas, I'd love to discuss them at the end. Okay, next slide. Median after-tax income. So we looked at median after-tax income because just to give you a quick definition, median after-tax income, median means that obviously this is not an average. We're looking at the median income. So if you line up all individuals according to their income from lowest to highest, and you take the middle number, this is the number that we're showing you here. And after tax obviously means after taxes have been taken away. And the CRA has access to all of this data. So it's pretty accurate, right? When it's coming from StatCan, that means that this is almost like 100% data. But this is not employment income. After-tax income here includes, let's say, like pensions or other forms of social assistance or other sources of income, for example, investments that people might be getting. So what we see here is that median after-tax income decreases with age. When we look at linguistic identity, we see that English speakers age 75 plus have a higher median after-tax income than their age peers. So let's look at the data here. So for total age, again, this is for the total population. What we know about English speakers and French speakers in Quebec is that English speakers generally earn a lower median after-tax income than French speakers. So that's the 34,000 that you see in the first bar graph here. And then French speakers have 36,800. So that's the numbers that I'm usually used to dealing with. But when we look at the age breakdown for individuals who are 45 and older, it gets more interesting. So again, the trend holds for 45 to 54. English speakers tend to earn less than French speakers. That's 43,200 versus 48,000 for individuals age 45 to 54. That trend also holds for 55 to 64. We have lower incomes for English speakers. However, again, we see the trend flipping for seniors who are 65 and older. We're seeing here that English speakers actually earn more, and pardon the numbers that are overlapping there. I actually can't see what that number is supposed to be, but English speakers do earn slightly more, right? So it's like 31,000 versus 31,000. So it's maybe a few $100s more that English speakers are earning than French speakers. And then when we look at individuals age 75 and over, we're seeing a difference of about 2,600 there in terms of median after-tax income. So again, pretty interesting that that trend tends to shift at 65 and older. Okay, next slide, please. So this is median employment income. So employment income, this one might be perhaps a little bit more interesting in the sense that we're now looking specifically at income that is earned solely from employment. So these are individuals who are in the labor market, who are working, and StatCan is tracking how much money did they make in the year that the census took place. So what we see here is that median employment income decreases with age. So this is generally true, right? As we get older, we tend to earn less employment income. When we look at linguistic identity, we see that English speakers age 65 and older have a median income that is higher than their age peers. So I will draw your attention to the graph here. Again, similar trends, 45 to 54, we have a lower employment income amongst English speakers and French speakers. 55 to 64, it actually starts to flip a little bit. We see that English speakers earn $400 more in median income than French speakers, but we really see a big difference here in the 65 to 74 age range. We see that English speakers in that age group are earning about $14,300 per year, compared to French speakers who are earning about $7,950. So that's a huge difference, right? That's almost about $7,000 difference. That's a very huge income difference between English speakers and French speakers in that age bracket. And then when we look at 75 years and over, understandably, most people are no longer in the labor market and are not receiving employment-related income. So the incomes are quite low here, but you'll still see here that English speakers are earning slightly more. So what this tells us here is that English speakers, if they have a higher employment income, that means that they're probably working, maybe they're working more, maybe they're working longer, or maybe they're working jobs that have a higher wage, right? Which would explain why their employment income here is higher. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so low income cutoff. So low income cutoff is actually, I would say, one of the more interesting variables that we looked at. So as a reminder, low income cutoff is basically a measure that is used by Statistics Canada to understand individuals who are quote unquote low income. So what they do is they will put together kind of a calculation of what is the average income that a person makes in a specific community, in a specific city. And it's all relative depending on where they live, how many people are in their family. And they will set an amount and they will see how many people live below this low income cutoff. And if there's people that are below this set amount for, low income, then those individuals are considered low income. So here, what we have in the graph is the percentage of people who are below the low income cutoff. So they are individuals who are considered low income. So the percentage of individuals living under the LICO threshold decreases from age 55 with age. But when we break it down according to linguistic identity, we see that a higher percentage of English-speaking mature workers live under the low income cutoff than their linguistic age peers. So what this means basically, and why we really got interested in this variable was up until now, we've been seeing data that shows us that Mature English speakers, particularly individuals who are 65 and older, they tend to be remaining longer in the labor market. They have a higher labor force participation. They have higher incomes. They have a higher employment income. And usually when we look at that, we're thinking like, okay, that means that they're doing well, right? They're healthier. They're wanting to keep working. They're making more money. Usually that can be read as a typically good thing to see. But when we look at the low income cutoff, this is where it gets really interesting, because what we see is that actually maybe English speakers are working longer and making more money in the labor market because a lot of them are living in low income situations, right? So in this graph, you'll see that for the total population, English speakers tend to have a higher proportion of people who live under the low income cutoff. So 8.9% of English speakers as a whole, regardless of age, live under the low income cutoff, compared to 4.5% of French speakers. So that's pretty much double the amount, right, of French speakers. And this trend holds across all the age groups, right? So this was pretty shocking. So whether you're looking at 45 to 54, or you're looking at 75 years and over, we're seeing that English speakers, by far, a lot more of them proportionally are living under the low income cutoff, and they're actually considered low income by the federal government. Okay, next slide, please. So we decided to also look at poverty rate. So because we assumed, well, if more individuals are living in low income, more English speaking individuals are, then perhaps the poverty rates reflect that as well. And guess what? They did. Poverty rates are consistently higher among English speakers in Quebec. And this is across all the age groups. So we actually pulled the age brackets for everyone here. And in terms of the total poverty rate, we know that English speakers are more likely to live in poverty. So about 10% of English speakers across the province, irrespective of age, live in poverty, compared to 5.8% of French speakers. It is extremely high for individuals who are 15 to 24. But when we look at the progressive age brackets, so for example, 45 to 54, it's 7.8% compared to 5.5% among French speakers. For individuals who are 55 to 64, 10% of them, so 1 in 10 people, are living in poverty, compared to French speakers at 8.3%. And then for individuals who are 65 and older, we see that English speakers have 5.4% of English speakers in that age range are living in poverty, compared to 3.2%. So I think the poverty rate, I think, is an important one, just to contextualize a lot of this labor force data, right? Because what that made us think is that perhaps, again, as we age, as English speakers age, we're staying longer in the labor market, maybe not always because we want to, but because we have to. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so key takeaways for the statistics. So mature and senior English speakers make up a smaller proportion of their linguistic community as compared to French speakers. So we generally just have a smaller community than French speakers. As compared to French speakers, English speakers age 65 and over have higher rates of labor force participation, and a higher proportion of English speakers are living below the low income cutoff as compared to French speakers. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. And this is going to be our qualitative data. So that concludes the quantitative data that we collected from the Census of Canada. And now I'm going to turn you to a project that we've been working on. So this is a qualitative research project that we worked on from fall of last year, and we are now in the midst of drafting the final report. So the name of the project is Supporting the Economic and Community Integration of Mature English Speakers in Quebec. This project aims to strengthen the role of employability organizations that support mature English speakers and thus promote their vitality. To do so, it utilizes an arts-based qualitative research approach to highlight the needs of mature English-speaking workers and the institutional needs of organizations that provide employability support to them. This increased understanding can be translated into advocacy efforts and policy and programming solutions. So just to give you a summary of this project, this was a project that was sponsored by Heritage Canada, We worked on this project in partnership with another organization called La Passerelle, which provides employment services to mature workers, both English speakers and French speakers. And what we did is we did a qualitative research project where we used different research methods, including focus groups, where we sat down with some mature English speaking workers and we asked them some questions that are related to their experiences in the labor market. So the next few slides, I'm going to be sharing some of the results of those focus groups, just to give you an idea of what we learned. Okay, next slide, please. So these are some of the themes that came up in our focus groups with those 22 individuals. So the topic of the day was ageism. So this came up a lot in our conversations with participants. So participants described explicitly ageist experiences in the labor market. So they talked a lot about how recruiters would comment on the numbers of years they had left when they were talking to them and when they were, looking for work. They also talked about how they would have difficulty pinpointing experiences of ageism. So, for example, even though people might not be explicitly ageist towards you, you can kind of tell when they are, right? If they're asking weird questions, or if they're being avoidant, or if they look at your resume and they're being dismissive, or you just don't get a call back even though you had an excellent interview. Participants talked about how ageism is a very complex and difficult issue and challenge for us, because in many cases it's not always explicitly been pinpointed. The other thing that they talked about was how ageism intersects with other things. So for example, for the women in the group, they talked about how gender intersected with ageism for them. So for example, women talked about how they had pressure to dye their hair because they thought that that would increase their job prospects. Some participants also described how their immigration status and their experiences intersected with ageism. So for example, one worker was an immigrant, so they talked about how because they were older, they actually scored lower on the immigration assessments, right? Because our governments here prioritize workers who are younger and who will have a longer runway in the labor market. We also talked about language. So participants described linguistic barriers to employment. So they talked about how, obviously for some English speakers, they do face French language barriers to the labor market. So it was challenging for them to navigate a labor market, particularly, let's say, as an older worker, and also still facing linguistic barriers in addition to the ageism. And they also talked about a sense of belonging in workplaces and how it might be challenging for them to be in the labor market or be in the workforce when they are in predominantly French language workplaces and their French might not be, as good, for example. Next slide, please. But it wasn't all pessimistic. There was also benefits of mature workers that really came up a lot in these focus groups. So our participants talked about how mature workers bring a lot of wisdom to the workplace. They bring a lot of emotional maturity. They bring practical knowledge to the workplace. They talked about how age is a form of diversity and that we really need to have diverse workplaces and it makes us stronger, and that this should be introduced as a part of improving workplaces. They also talked about mental health and a sense of belonging. So participants described how work gave them a sense of routine, a sense of purpose, of community, and for these reasons, it was crucial to their well-being. So we actually talked to participants who said that even though they didn't have to work anymore, they actually enjoyed remaining in the labor market because it was something that kept their life interesting, right? And they talked about the negative impacts of not working for them could include depression, anxiety, and isolation. Some participants also described their need to work because their pension was insufficient to cover their rising costs of living. So this actually echoes that quantitative data we saw, right? That showed higher rates of individuals in low income and in poverty. Next slide, please. Ageism in the workplace. Participants described the negative assumptions that they experienced according to their age within the workplace. So for example, there was the assumption that they're not physically fit. So for example, we had a participant who was actually quite fit. He stayed in shape, he biked every day and he wanted a job that was more active. but he described, experiences with hiring managers who would assume that he wouldn't be able to do the work, even though he said, yes, I am, just, give me a chance. He talked about how there was the assumption that because they were older, they would be unwilling to work with younger managers. So they talked about how sometimes that idea of ageism is projected on them, that perhaps because they're older workers, they would have a problem being in a workplace with younger people. And a lot of the participants said that that was the opposite of the case. They were actually looking to be in a diverse and dynamic workplace. They also talked about being often characterized with a lack of opportunity. So they were often passed over for projects or promotions because of their age. They also talked about attitudes towards aging. They described continual learning experiences and firsts. So a lot of participants talked about how, for them, age was not an issue. They loved being in their, 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s. A lot of them are still experiencing their first marriages, their first business ownership, and you know, given that we're living longer now, they were really pushing the idea that we really need to shift our ideas around age, and specifically around age in the labor market, right? They reported continued desire to grow and learn, and they said that they wanted to remain sharp, and that even though these traits are considered typically youthful, right, for them, it was just their personality and who they were. And they really wanted to just ensure that employers are, opening their minds and are sensitized to how some of these attitudes towards aging are actually holding everyone back. Okay, next slide, please. So I'm going to end with a quote here. So this is a quote from one of our participants who said that, I guess the biggest challenge is not to buy into this idea that you have less value. I'm very interested in not giving my power away to a culture that might be youth obsessed. And I just love this quote because I think it touches on a lot of aspects that came up in this research, which is that we do live in a culture that is very youth obsessed, right? We associate youth with intelligence, with power, with money, with everything, right? But participants spoke a lot about how, again, these are just cultural ideas, and that we can counter these, and that our society will only be better if we start to expand our ideas of value and who is valuable and what they can bring to society and the labor market. So yes, I'm just going to end on this quote, and I will now pass it over back to you, Andrew, and we can maybe have a discussion about this data. Thank you.
Thank you, Steph. That was a very informative and rich-filled presentation from you. So we appreciate that. It gave us a lot to think about. I just want to remind everyone to, if they have any questions for Stott, to put them in the chat right now, and I will make sure that she hears some of them. I have a few questions. I don't know if you have the answers, but let's try and see if we can do something. I saw some of this data when you presented it, a preliminary version of it a few weeks ago, and alarm bells were just ringing in my head about what this could mean. You kind of touched on some of it when you were talking. Do you have any hypothesis as to why is it that English speakers have a higher labor force participation as they age? They earn a higher median employment income, but they're living more in poverty. Is that a reason? Do you have any thoughts after looking at this?
Yeah, I mean, I thought that was interesting too. I mean, I didn't have any big assumptions before we started the project, right? We kind of just went in expecting to see that probably there would be a linguistic difference. Like that would be the main thing, right? It would be the language piece that generally English speakers tend to perform worse in the labor market. We then ended up looking at that poverty and low income data because, again, that labor force data didn't make sense to us. We first saw it and we thought, oh, higher incomes, that's great. Like that means that actually English speaking seniors are doing great. And then when we looked at the poverty data, that completely just turned it upside down. So I don't know, honestly. I do think that obviously as we age, right, we do tend to have lower incomes, right? More people do tend to fall into poverty and low income. That's a general trend that's irrespective of language, right? but we do see in our data here that there is a linguistic difference, and that makes me think that perhaps it is about language, right? So why would English speakers who are age 65 and older have double the poverty rate than French speakers unless, there is a linguistic component to that? And it might be a question of maybe there's a language barrier, so they can't access the same level of services that are might be, or like social assistance that might, or financial assistance that's available to them. Maybe they need assistance with finding those pathways because maybe the francophone seniors are better connected, right? And they don't face a language barrier, so they can maybe more easily access financial and social assistance. Or maybe it's kind of a compounding, right? If you spend a lifetime as an English speaker here and you've been earning lower incomes throughout your lifetime than French speakers, then maybe, of course, maybe when you get to 60s and 70s, those lower incomes have compounded and you find that you have much less money in your retirement savings than a French speaker does, right? And we're also smaller communities. Our communities are declining, particularly in the region. So they might have less family, right, and less access to people that could help them. So I think maybe there's several things that are going on here, but I'm not sure. I'd actually say maybe you guys are the experts here. I'd love to hear what you think and what you suspect might be happening.
It's funny because as you started showing the data, you show higher labor force participation, and it kind of goes up as it well, not goes up, but it remains high as it ages. So my immediate thought was, I guess this is an older generation of 75 plus that maybe almost predates Bill 101, that maybe helped set up companies years and years ago. And I thought this would be a lot of business owners or like, higher up folks. Then you showed the median income for it, and it's not reflective of someone who owns a business. So then I was like, oh, that kind of changes my initial thought of what that could mean. Someone put a question in, and I want to kind of tailor with the question I also have, and I don't. So I'll ask the first question is does the data identify full-time or differentiate between full-time versus part-time employment?
Not this data that I have in front of you, but this is data that we did pull. So we're going to have that in our final report. Unfortunately, I don't have it in front of me, but that would be interesting to look at. Why do you ask? Do you suspect that maybe there's higher part-time work amongst English speakers?
Well, it could be a reason for it. Maybe it's
Mm-hmm.
something that there's maybe everything you said, right? There's less, you're earning less money for your whole life. Maybe you got to go back to work for a part-time role, maybe not a full-time role, but maybe it's something to just help with some of the savings you have. Because my other question, and I don't think there's any way to determine this in the data, but do you think there's any way that we would know that if some folks maybe did retire and then felt the pinch and went back to work as they aged, is that could be a reason why the 75 plus cohort has a way higher labor force participation? I don't think we can get that from the data, but that could be something qualitatively we could try to explore.
That would be a very good question. I would love to know that. So it wouldn't be in the quantitative data, right? Because there's no like measurement that they have. They don't ask a question like, have you retired? So I wish the census would ask that actually. Like, did you retire? Because I think then that would actually help us understand a lot of what's happening. All they ask you is, have you been looking for work, right? So we don't know how many of those people actually had retired and then re-entered. But I think you might be onto something, that there are people who decide to come back, right? Because they have to.
That'd be a good follow-up question if we can get something. Let's take notes of that, Katsia. Make sure we can do that somewhere else. It's fine if we can do that. One of my other questions was is going to look at labor in a more broad sense. I know that from past research other community groups have done is French speakers tend to be way more overrepresented in trade unions, in manufacturing jobs over English speakers. Making assumptions here, but a lot of those jobs tend to be union jobs, which would have maybe a better kind of defined pension plan and better benefits. Could unions play a role in the fact that maybe French speakers are able to retire or more comfortably at 65 or around that time versus English speakers?
That could be, and actually to support that, for the person who asked about part-time and full-time, I remember the data for the English-speaking community as a whole. So English speakers generally do tend to work part-time and have more temporary work than French speakers at higher rates. So this is for the total population. I just don't remember the breakdown for 45 plus. So assuming that we know, right, that the average English speaker tends to work more part-time, more temporary, we can assume that they're probably less likely to be working in those unionized jobs, right, which are full-time with that steady wage and the pension. So that might actually be a factor, right? And a lot of those unionized jobs, they tend to be like heavily francophone environments, right? So if you're someone that, has that French language barrier, then it's probably going to be more challenging for you to break into that field, right? And have those types of jobs as well. So that would be interesting to find out actually.
Glad we're posing a lot of good questions.
Yeah,
Said we
I
don't have a
like
lot of good
those.
answers to them just yet,
And
but
actually the industry breakdown too, right? We did see that there is that prevalence of healthcare and social assistance jobs as well in education, right? So we kind of do see that English speakers are in those jobs, right? But maybe they're like part-time and maybe they're not unionized, right? Like it depends. There's a huge range of jobs that fall under that industry. So yeah,
I'm
that,
guessing
that would be.
if we looked at a wider spectrum, because we looked at those classifications from 45 to 54 and 55 to
Mhm,
64 and so on and so forth. I wonder if you look at the data from 25 to 35 or 34 and then 35 to 44, if we're seeing that same trend happening. So if you're going to see that everyone who's, 34, 35 to 44 is working those same jobs. So when they, in the next census, when they maybe move up to a different age group, they're just going to stay in that same thing. It's a perpetual problem.
It
We're
is
not
a
switching
perpetual
careers.
problem. Yeah, I mean, manufacturing remains the top three, right? So the average English speaker, they're working in manufacturing jobs. A lot of them increasingly are immigrants, right? Because the English speaking community is growing primarily due to immigrant English speakers moving here. And a lot of them, right, kind of get pigeonholed, unfortunately, into jobs that are often in manufacturing, even though they're overqualified. So there's another variable that StatCan uses called the overqualification variable. We're actually going to be publishing that in our next round of employment profiles. And what it shows that English speakers are heavily overqualified. They tend to have, higher rates of high school graduation, post-secondary degrees, but then you will find that their job level, right, is often lower than their level of education, right, which is how we calculate overqualification. So there's all to say, Andrew, for your theories, there's actually several variables that I think we could look at that kind of show that, right, that it's also about job quality, and that's a big issue here, right?
Mhm, of course. I guess my other questions is going to be more about procedural more so than the research. You mentioned that this is all basically StatsCan census data, and the biggest knock on it is that it's only available every 5 years. So you're looking at this
Mm-hmm.
for every 5 years, and even the questions are asked: Have you looked for work in the last 2 weeks or 2 months? And that can be very specific to that that time of your life when you're getting censused in May of the year. Um,
Mm-hmm.
has PERT, or do you know of any other organization petitioning the government of Canada, the government of Quebec, to try and collect more frequent labor force data?
Yeah, that's actually one of our biggest recommendations, right? And one of the things that we're advocating for is it's just not enough to have data every 5 years, right? And the challenges of the last census is, if you all remember taking it, is it was during the pandemic, right? So the labor market and everything was weird, right? It's just like a really unusual year. So relying on that 2021 data, in some cases it's very helpful, but in other cases having something that would be more recent, like from last year, would be a lot more helpful just to understand where we're actually at. Um, in terms of the census, I don't imagine that the census will ever move from being less than 5 years. But there are other things that they can do. So for example, the federal government collects a labor market survey, and this is like a monthly labor market snapshot that they take where they look at job vacancies They look at where people are working, how many people are working. And this is what helps like every provincial government and also the federal government to actually develop their labor market policies. This labor market survey is very detailed. They even now have a visible minority breakdown of people in the labor market. So we've been advocating for them to actually do a linguistic breakdown. And we've been
Right.
saying it's actually would be such a low lift if you're already surveying people, just to ask them, right, do you identify as an English speaker or French speaker? And then if they added that variable, then we could go from having data every 5 years to actually having data every like other month. And I think that would be fantastic. And I
That would
think
be
that's
super
one of the
helpful.
things that we're pushing for. And it's more likely to happen at the federal government level, to be honest, I think,
Mhm.
than the provincial government, which I would say has been largely more reluctant, right, to collect linguistic based data.
Great. I have one more question someone sent me afterwards, so I'll just go back to the research. I know in what you presented to us, another question came out too, so I'll ask one quickly. Is there a gender divide? The research you were working, did you see that, as English speaking mature workers age, is it women who tend to go back to work or are still in the labor force? Is it men mainly? Is there a gender divide there?
So I believe we did look at data, gender, sorry. Unfortunately, we don't have it in this slide. I'd have to get back to you. I think my instinct is that maybe there wasn't, hence why we didn't highlight it, because we looked through all the variables, but I don't want to provide misinformation. But that's actually a good question. Do you think there would be a gender difference?
I am at this whole data is completely turning me on my head, so I don't want to make any assumptions. I had things I thought would happen as you mature and as mature labor worker, English speaking workers age. So I don't want to make any assumptions or incorrect statements. So I'd love to see if when you get that data, if it's in a report somewhere, I'd love to see what it looks like.
I'm just writing that down to make sure that we have that in there. But I mean, we know that women tend to live longer, right? So I wouldn't be surprised. My guess is you probably have slightly more women who are engaged, but you never know because in terms of data for the total population, men tend to be the one, right, who are often more represented in the labor market, right? Just generally because we know that women tend to take on a lot more roles, right? They're not only working, some of them are caregivers, they're taking care of children, they're taking on a lot of work. So sometimes they get pulled out of the labor market a lot longer for bigger gaps than men do over their career. So yeah, knowing what we know about the general population, I guess the question now is what about senior women, right? When the kids have moved out of home and let's say your husband has passed, right? Then maybe that puts you in a position where you actually do need to get back into the labor market. So we might see a flip.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, I'll make sure we include that for sure.
Great. And then the final question, I know you guys do this sometimes, but have you done any comparisons to other OLMCs across Canada in terms of mature workers in other OLMCs in Ontario or the Maritimes, anywhere like that? Is there a difference, or are we? Because I know they tend to be doing better off typically in the labor force and in
Mhm,
income. So is it
mhm.
the same trend as with mature workers?
So we have done comparisons to other OLMCs again for the general population. We haven't pulled it specifically for mature workers, but I'll look and see if I can get an answer for you, Andrew. But the general trend for all the age groups for the general labor market is that OLMCs in the rest of Canada tend to fare better, right? So when we talk about OLMCs in the rest of Canada, these are francophones, right? So francophones in like Alberta or Nova Scotia, right? They tend to have quite high incomes. They tend to do pretty well on the labor market. It's really English speakers in Quebec who are the OLMC that has the lowest incomes, the highest unemployment rates, the highest poverty rates. So I would suspect that that trend holds, right, for older English speakers. But I will definitely look into that for a confirmation.
Wonderful. Well, Stahl, we're reaching towards the end here, and I have no more questions, and I don't want to open any more cans of worms by poking too many things. So I will just say thank you very much on behalf of everyone at Seniors Action Quebec. Our executive director, Kathy, is on the line. My name is Andrew Palucci. I'm the director of policy and governance.
Oh, wait,
Thank you.
Andrew, I don't know if you saw it, but there was just one last comment from Alina here, if you want
Oh,
to just read it.
yeah, she says many English speakers in the 40 plus group tend to be self-employed with only RRSP contributions. The new gig employment market, contract work. Some manage to get a corporate job with retirement benefits, but not long enough to provide the income they would need in retirement. Most of these are highly educated and not satisfied to accept just any job. The cycle repeats itself for the rest of their lives. So thank you, Lana, for that comment. Brendan, our tech wizard, just put a survey in the chat. If you would please take the time to answer it quickly, it just helps us with some feedback. Stahl, thank you so much for this. This research is super important. Are you guys putting a whole brief together? Is there going to be something available that we can circulate to people?
Yes, so we're going to have a report, a final report that's coming out with all of this data, including the qualitative research project that we had. I took down some of the questions that you had, Andrew. Excellent questions. I'm definitely going to see if we can incorporate some answers to those in there. I think we have the data, but I'll double check. And that final report is going to be coming out on our website. So if you want more information about PERT, yeah, I'm sure you guys can share it. And also the slide presentation will be shared with you as well. So yes, thank you for having me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Don. Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you to our funders, the Department of Canadian Heritage, once again. Without further ado, I think we're just around 11 o'clock. So any more questions? No? I think we're good. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great day.
Take care.